No, Dr. Pandit, we've had on this show scientists before. We've had individuals that have promoted the literal account of the book of Genesis. And we've had people, when we've aired these shows, who've posted, like say on social media, that evolution is a fact, undeniable fact. What would you say to someone like that?
Well, I've met some of them when I was at the University of Arkansas. There were 5 atheistic biology professors who came and occupied the first row.
When you were doing a presentation?
When I was doing my presentations, and they told me, evolution is a fact. So I said, all right, that's your theory. Will you allow another theory at all, or are you going to stick right there? They said, we don't mind looking at another theory. So I said, all right, let's look at your theory. Let's take the book, Origin of Species, which you're supposed to base all your statements on, and let's ask ourselves some questions on the theory itself. And if you realize when you look at the book, how Charles Darwin has stated it out, he destroys his own theory in his book. Very few people have actually read the book. Do you know that? Both in the Christian and the believing world, and those who are in the evolutionary world, 99.5% of them have never read the book. That is one of the reasons I really felt I need to read that book. And by the way, you can't just read the book once and you understand it all. I had to read it 5 times, cover to cover. Then I realized, oh, now I got what Darwin is saying. And then when you look at that, then I started underlining here and a point over there in the book. And when I went back and forth, I realized he has broken down his own theory in his book.
Any other questions? Right over there.
How did Darwin contradict himself?
Here's one of the ways he contradicted himself. One, he started his book with the first chapter, which is variations under domestication. That means in the breeding experiments, all right? Then he took all those principles. By the way, there was nothing in nature, that's why he went there. He went to the breeding principles and looked at all the breeding principles and simply took the whole amount and put it into nature, and he said, now, nature is how it happened. This is how it happened, and that's the theory of evolution. But here's the catch. In the question of breeding, he will tell you over and over again in his own book that the fundamental basic ingredient, if you want to call it that ingredient, in breeding is the breeder. You take him off, you have no breeding. So your whole breeding experiment crashes. When he took the whole principle to nature, he could not find a breeder, so he simply left it out. If you put a breeder there, you don't have your theory, because a breeder here is the agent called God. So he has destroyed it in that sense. In another sense, he has destroyed it here again. He says that selection, natural selection, that's the word people use, natural selection. The word selection, if I gave you a basket of 10 apples and I said select, how many will you have? You'll have less. Think, selection must result in actually less than what there is. The word natural selection must actually come to less. The maximum it can have is equal, which again, that's not really selection, that's grabbing. So now look at the amount of genetic material that we have in the smallest organisms. In the viruses, for example. I'll tell you how much they are. The genetic material is 500,000 units. In the human, now this has been going up, until we come to the humans. The Homo sapien has 3 billion units. How can selecting from 500,000 reach you to 3 billion? You can't. In fact, the word selection itself is an absolute block to evolution. If you select, you can't have more than what there is, unless you add. Now, there was a very important landmark decision that was made in 1980 by the evolutionary scientists who met in Chicago. Their fundamental question was, can the small changes actually accumulate so that we have a big change? The small changes is called microevolution, and the big change is called macroevolution. Can the small changes add? And they realized there's no mechanism of adding at all. Natural selection is only selection. What you need in evolution is selection plus adding, but there's no mechanism at all. In fact, there's a quote by Charles Darwin himself. When we descend to the details, we cannot prove that one species has changed, nor can we prove that these supposed changes were beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory. I have stated it verbatim. If these are the words of Charles Darwin, he has destroyed his own theory flat. There's nothing left.
This could be another episode. Say someone looks at this world and sees the brokenness of this world, the imperfection of this world, the violence of this world, and then to try to reconcile that with this idea that God is good, God is perfect, God is holy. You can see why there's a lot of tension that exists between just a world that is very imperfect, oftentimes appeal this with this idea that there is an intelligent designer, not just an intelligent designer, but a good God.
Actually, there are two questions there. One is whether there's a God, the other is whether he's a good God. So this question of suffering is not whether there is a God. What kind of a God is he? That's the question. So what they do is they mix it up and say, because I can't answer that, therefore I can agree that there is no God. But no, that's a faulty reasoning. The reasoning should be, okay, there is a bad God, but that means you're agreeing that there's a God. So let's agree to that at least. So once you go into the depth of this question, you realize that actually the argument really breaks down. For one thing, you are making the argument only when you're looking at the pain and suffering and evil, right? How about the good? If your pain and suffering means that there is no God, then the good and the pleasures must mean that there is a God. You have to explain that as well. So actually they cancel out in one sense, but in one sense they don't. Because when you look at any jurisdiction and you find evidence for the presence of something, as well as evidence for the absence of that thing, which we are doing now, both are present in our world, evil as well as good. When both are present, absence as well as presence, presence always wins. Because any small amount of evidence for the present will knock off all the evidence for the absence. You see, suppose I'm asking whether my son is at home, and we have 20 rooms in our home. So for me to say he's not at home, I have to go through all the 20 rooms. Only then can I say he's not at home. But for him to be at home, for me to say he is at home, I only need to see his finger around the door on the first door. I don't have to get inside at all. So what am I saying? I am saying that the smallest amount of evidence for the existence of any entity knocks off all the evidences for the absence of that entity.